would like to thank you for your continued interest in the Collingwood grain terminals and our built heritage assessment. The terminals are a classic asset that help to physically tell a story about the broader Great Lakes and our region's history. They are seen from land and water, and many perceive them as an iconic symbol of Collingwood. The Built Heritage Assessment is another step forward in determining the future of the grain terminals, and in doing so, the town seeks to support a healthy, strong, and vibrant community that recognizes the value of our history and heritage while responsibly managing for a solid fiscal future. During Consultation 1 of the Built Heritage Assessment, we had over 400 people complete the online survey. Thank you. Today's engagement is part of the second phase of this consultation, which included both an in-person event, which took place on Saturday, September 18th, and an online survey located on Engage Collingwood, which is open until September 30th. Next slide, please. Tonight, we will receive a presentation from Amy Barnes, Heritage Project Manager, and Kayla Jonas Galvin, Heritage Operations Manager, who are from Archaeological Research Associates, or ARA. This presentation is on the preliminary heritage attributes of the grain terminals and surrounding area, and it will be followed by a question and answer period. Shelby, Executive Assistant, Town of Collingwood, will be our moderator and manage the technical details of the session. Next slide, please. We encourage participation and have reserved time at the end of our formal presentations for question and answer. Should your question not be addressed during this session, every effort will be made to respond to your question following the session. To ask a question, open the Q&A window, type your question into the Q&A box and click send. Responses will be provided via text in the Q&A window, or your question will be shared live, read out loud by the moderator. If the moderator replies via Q&A, you will see a reply in the Q&A window. To raise your hand, select the raise hand icon. The moderator will give you permission to unmute and talk during the webinar, and all participants will be able to hear you. You will receive a notification at that time to stay muted or unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself. I will also note that this webinar is being recorded. Next slide, please. To ask a question by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9 and unmute when prompted by pressing *6. You will be identified by your area code and the last 3 digits of your phone number. So for example, 1705546. Once the host identifies your number, you will receive a prompt indicating that the host would like you to unmute your microphone, and you can press *6 to unmute. Next slide, please. In order to frame tonight's engagement within the overall grain terminals project, we wanted to share this overview, which highlights this assessment within the project at large. This project overview and key details on the current state of the grain terminals can be found on the Collingwood Engage page under Collingwood Grain Terminals in the white paper. The Built Heritage Assessment is concurrently happening with the search for redevelopment advisor, and that opportunity is currently posted as an active tender on Bid and Go. The next step in this process is the drafting of an RFP to seek interested parties for the redevelopment project. Tonight, we will hear how the Built Heritage Assessment will be a foundational component of this next step. Next slide, please. Recognizing that there is a broad potential range of processes and end states, it is Council's intentions that decisions will comply with mandatory policy objectives. For the purpose of tonight's engagement, I wish to draw your attention to a mandatory policy objective that speaks specifically to heritage. That is, respects and celebrates the historic significance of the terminals and the shipyards, including maintenance of or tribute to the iconic resemblance of the terminals. Next slide, please. Council has also set out additional desired policy objectives, including retaining the visual facade of the terminals. These policy objectives can be found within the white paper posted on Engage Collingwood. In the interest of time, I will not read them all, but I encourage you to review these objectives and the white paper. Next slide, please. So with that, this includes our introductory comments, and I would now like to introduce Amy and Kayla from ARA, who will present on the preliminary heritage attributes of the grain terminals, followed by a question and answer period. Thank you.
So, hi everyone. I hope you can see my screen now. Somebody, one of the other panelists can unmute themselves and let me know if that is not happening. As Amanda said, I am Kayla and I am the Heritage Operations Manager at ARA, and I am here to present our portion of this project. So what we wanted to talk about tonight from our perspective is give you a little background about heritage and in general what legislative requirements and processes we are following and how that plays into this specific built heritage assessment. And then talk about the engagement that's happened before we started this, so that's survey 1. And then talk about future opportunities, including the survey that is currently open, and give you some timelines as to the next engagement that will be happening. And as Amanda said, we will also be undertaking a question and answer period following that. So the legislation that we're operating under is the Ontario Heritage Act. It's been around for a while. It was originally passed in 1975, and it's been amended since with major amendments in 2005. And there has been some minor amendments this year as well. It sets up the Ontario Heritage Trust, which many of you probably know as the Ontario Heritage Foundation. They set up those blue plaques all over the province. So if you've ever stopped to read them, or maybe that's just me, they are set up by that foundation. But it also gives enabling powers to municipalities. So it enables municipalities to conserve their heritage. Doesn't require it, but it does enable it. And it sets out the procedure for that recognition and protection. So formal designation under this Heritage Act is one way of publicly recognizing a property's heritage importance to the community, and it helps ensure the conservation for the future enjoyment of the cultural heritage resource. There are 2 types of designations under the Ontario Heritage Act that the municipalities can enact. One is individual property designation, and that is Part 4. So individual properties, and the other is Heritage Conservation District designation, which is Part 5. And I know Collingwood does have a Heritage Conservation District, the Downtown Conservation District. And a property can be designated under Part 4 and Part 5. And we'll get into that a little bit later of how that may play out. So what's the point of designation? The point is not to freeze something in time and make it so that no changes can happen. The idea is to be able to manage change in a way that is consistent with the property's cultural heritage value. So to be able to ensure that new uses or different uses can be found while still conserving the cultural heritage value. So what exactly is cultural heritage value? Well, in Ontario, we have something called Ontario Regulation 906, and it has 3 overarching criteria that tell us this is what cultural heritage value in Ontario means. It means a property has design or physical value, historical or associative value, or contextual value. So these are pretty broad categories, 3 pretty broad categories. So the regulation breaks it down even further. Each of these categories has 3 subcategories. So basically we have 9 criteria telling us what could cultural heritage value in Ontario mean. A property only needs to meet one of these criteria to be considered of cultural heritage value. So although there are 9 and many properties may meet all 9 of them, you only have to be one to be considered culturally heritage significant. So just to go over them, design value, design or physical value means it's rare, unique, representative of an early type, expression, material, or construction method. So that's a lot of words, but basically it means, is it a building that is easily recognizable as an architectural style that we recognize, or a type of building? So in this case, a grain terminal. Does it display a high degree of craftsmanship or artistic merit? Or does it demonstrate a high degree of technical or scientific achievement? So traditionally, cultural heritage resources were those grand manors that were very clearly an architectural style. These criteria have broadened that to recognize many different types of cultural heritage resources, including industrial buildings. Historical or associative value is the next category, and probably what people are most familiar with when we think about history and stories. So a property has cultural heritage value in this category if it has a direct association with a theme, event, belief, person, activity, organization that is significant to the community. So that key part, significant to the community. Some things are associated with people very strongly. They've lived there for a long time, but in terms of their level of significance to a community, that may not be expressed. Yields or has the potential to yield information that contributes to the understanding of a community and culture. This one seems a bit abstract, but can be used for things like archaeological resources or cemeteries, things that we don't maybe know all the information about. Or it demonstrates or reflects the ideas of an architect, artist, builder, or designer who is significant to the community. Again, we're looking for significance to the community, which is one of the reasons we ask lots of questions during engagement to try and get these answers in terms of significance to a community. Contextual value is the third category. And this one is about a property's fitting in its overall context or landscape. So it's important in defining or maintaining the character of an area. It's physically, functionally, visually, or historically linked to its surroundings, or it is a landmark. So the way I like to think of contextual value is if you picked up a building, this building, any building, and moved it to another town, another city, what would you be losing about that building? Its setting, its connections to that community, either visually or how it created an economy there, or how it created a gathering space there. So that's what contextual value is, thinking about its setting in a larger landscape. So we express this value through something called a statement of cultural heritage value. And that statement is a way of expressing the values in a succinct way and capturing all these varied meanings of a place. And it really focuses on what makes the property important and communicates those to a broad audience. It has 3 sections. So heritage likes things in 3s, I guess. One is the description of the historic place. So what exactly are we looking at? The second is what of those values related to Ontario Regulation 906, which ones do we care about and why do we care about them? And then the third part, which is the heritage attributes, which are those physical things that relate to the values. We're going to get into those a little bit more in a minute, but I want to talk about values just a little bit more before we move on. So a cultural heritage statement of value is a couple of things, what we've already discussed, but it's also not some things. So it's not a detailed history of a historic place. The Built Heritage Report or designation reports is going to have all those details in terms of everything that happened in the history, the land registry, historic photos, a more robust history. And that's what's going to be in our Built Heritage Assessment. This is a summary of that and pulling out those things that relate to those key values. It doesn't go into the condition of the historic place that can change over time. It doesn't contain information that's not related to the cultural heritage value or conservation advice. Again, that can change over time. It's also not the place for it. It can be in a different report, or advice about future development opportunities. So what we're doing is figuring out what's important to be considered in the future, but we're not talking about the future development opportunities. So getting back to that third category in terms of what is important and related to those values in terms of those heritage attributes. So what are heritage attributes? What does that third category of things mean? It means things that are tangible. So things that you can go and touch on the property, physically touch. They are directly related to the heritage value identified in the cultural heritage value statements. So an example that I was using when I was talking to people at the booth, which I think hopefully resonated with everyone, is that an example related to a house, because I think that's sometimes a little easier to understand. So say you value a house because it is an Italianate manor, going back to those manors, it's an Italianate manor, but it's had additions added over time, maybe an addition on the rear and an addition on the side. Well, when we look at the value, we can look at that first category and say it has design or physical value because it is a representative example of an Italianate house. We know that it's Italianate, it has the windows, it has the brackets, it has the massing of an Italianate house. So when we go to talk about the heritage attributes, we can talk about those specific things, the brackets, the windows, the doors, but we are not going to recognize the rear addition or the side addition as heritage attributes. Those may be things that are physically on the property, but they're not related to the value as we understand it. How does that relate to managing change at the end? What it means is that if someone wanted to change those 1960s additions, remove them, change a window in them, we can look at the heritage attributes and say, well, they're not heritage attributes. So in terms of managing change, we don't have to manage that specific change. We want to make sure it's complementary to the value that does exist, the Italianate style. But if you want to demolish it, that's fine. It's okay because it's not a heritage attribute. So that's how we relate what is a heritage attribute to the value and how that helps us manage change. So in relation to that, the heritage attributes also have to exist at the time that the statement is written. So that means that anything that was something that we aspired to but was never built. So sometimes there's plans about things that should have been built or additions that should have been added, a porch, those are not included. They capture the broad character of the place. So they are detailed, but not too detailed. And they have to be located within the boundaries of the formally recognized place. So heritage applies to real property. It applies to everything within the property boundary. And then, as I mentioned, we talk about those specific heritage attributes, so the specific pieces of the property that have cultural heritage value. So that means that everything has to be contained within that property. So things like views, although there may be really great views from outside of the property, in terms of what can actually be protected under the Heritage Act, it's only views or pieces of the property that are on the property. So we talked about this in terms of they must be retained in order to preserve that property's value. So examples of things that are heritage attributes, the material or craftsmanship. So the type of construction material, is it brick? Is it concrete? Is it wood? The scale, the style, the scale, the massing, or the composition. So how it was built, those styles that it represents. Any physical relationships that we can talk about, which may mean a one building's relationship to another, or perhaps the building's relationship to the street or to the water, as well as the location. So its location within the town, within the street, within the property, even if it's set back, if it is close to the lot line, and the forms. But again, it has to be related to that value that's already identified. So it is not a shopping list of elements. It's not a complete description of the property. It is elements that are related to the value. So elements that don't relate to the value are not included. So as I said, the list, if we were using the Italianate manor example, would not include those additions as attributes. Elements that no longer exist, they have been destroyed or never constructed, or conservation advice. So all of this is going to be included or is included in a built heritage assessment. So what does the process for that actually look like? It looks like going out to do a field survey. So going on site, taking photos, accessing buildings. And we like to go at least twice to get a real sense of the place. We also undertake research and historic mapping. So that can include land registry records, looking at historic photos, seeing if the city has any directories in terms of what businesses were there, looking at newspaper articles, as well as any previous studies. Then, using all that information, we dive into the Ontario Regulation 906 framework to go through each of those categories and decide if that building or property meets those categories. And then that's all put together in terms of report drafting and a statement of cultural heritage value or interest, as well as recommendations for the future. So that's all generally what we do. And that is all kind of the high level legislation and processes that we use. So what about this site? That's why you're all here. We want to talk about what we care about this site. So we have undertaken a field survey, and we've undertaken some preliminary engagement, and we've also undertaken some historic research. So using those things, we've come up with a draft statement of cultural heritage value, as well as draft heritage attributes. So I want to talk through these now. But we also really would like to encourage you to respond to Survey 2, where we've picked out some specific things that we'd like to hear feedback on, that we need clarity on in terms of these values and these heritage attributes, so that we can make sure, again, that we're representing the cultural heritage value of the community accurately. So in terms of the design or physical value, these are the value statements that we currently have in draft. And I maybe won't read them quite as in depth so that we can make sure that we have lots of time for question and answer, but we will go through all of them. So it has design or physical value as a representative example of an organically evolved harbor landscape. So it is just one portion of the harbor landscape, but we think the contribution to the overall harbor landscape is key. That the terminals themselves represent an increasingly rare type of industrial building on the Great Lakes. So we talked about how things can be representative, and that's the next one. It contains a representative of an urban grain terminal construction. So we did get some questions at the booth, so I wanted to talk about this just a little bit in terms of how we came up with that categorization. In terms of grain terminals across Canada, there's been a distinction made between two types of terminals, and that is, one is an urban grain terminal, which is primarily of concrete construction with the rounded silos. So when you think of ones perhaps in Toronto, those are also an urban construction, as opposed to a more rural square and wood construction type of material, which are primarily found in the prairies. So that was what our research showed in terms of the architectural of this building. So you'll see that when we get into the heritage attributes related to it. We did have some questions. Okay, concrete construction, how come that is a heritage attribute? Well, that is directly related to this heritage value. So it also contains, going on to the next value, it also contains a building from Collingwood's building industry, which is rare because it's the only remaining one, and it displays a high degree of technical achievement. So if you want to look at the actual criteria, in terms of the design or physical value, the 906 criteria, it's checking at least two of these boxes. It's has a rare building, it has a representative building, it is part of a representative harbor, so it's checking the first box, and it is displaying a high degree of technical or scientific achievement based on the construction methods used. Moving on to the historical or associative value, it is directly associated with the growth and development of the town of Collingwood. The Watts Boathouse, though not originally located on the site, brings a layer of history to the site and is an important tie to the harbor's historical activities. And it is also has an association, and this builder is known for his construction of grain terminals. So that is why we're pulling in this direct association with this architect and engineer. So if we look at the historical or associative value criteria, it does have direct associations with a theme, which we're talking about the growth. We're also talking about the important ties to the boat building activities. And then in terms of demonstrating or reflecting the ideas of an architect, builder, or artist, we are checking that box because it is associated with this architect and engineer who is well known for his building of grain terminals. So moving on to contextual value, we are looking at several check marks here. So it is important in defining the Collingwood waterfront, both as an area as physical remains of the industrial past in terms of the terminal, as well as the Watts Boathouse, though it's moved to that area, but also as its continued evolution. So an organically evolved landscape is something that is adapting to new uses over time and creating different layers of history over time. And so this is one place that is definitely happening in terms of keeping those industrial uses and buildings and kind of adapting to new uses in terms of the park space and the boating that is happening there. It is obviously historically linked to its surroundings. It's on the water because it was receiving and sending out grain, both from the water, from the marine side, as well as from the rail side. So if it was somewhere else, again, talking about if it was somewhere else, what would be different? If it was somewhere else, it wouldn't have both of those connections in terms of moving the grain. So it's functionally linked to its surroundings as the site of many industries that contribute to the town's economy and help spur the growth of the town. And as I think even Amanda said in her introduction, it is a visual landmark as an imposing concrete structure. So if we go to our next check boxes, it is actually checking all three of the check marks in the contextual value. It is important in defining that area. It is physically, functionally, visually, and historically linked to its surroundings in that location. And we know it is a landmark. So in terms of translating those into heritage attributes, We have put up a list for comment as part of survey 2 in terms of the actual attributes that we want to see commented on that relate to these values. So in terms of the grain terminals, I think we did already talk about the concrete construction. So why is that important? It helps us distinguish these types of buildings from other types of grain terminal buildings. The same with the cylindrical bins. The monumental scale obviously is related to a couple of those values in terms of the person who designed them and their specific layout, but it's also related to that suggestion of a landmark. What makes it a landmark? Well, obviously part of what makes it a landmark is its monumental scale. And how do we talk about landmark in a physical way? Basically the size and location of this building. The lack of decoration that is typical of industrial architecture is also one of the things that makes it unique. So this one also has, in terms of, we're talking about the historical connections in that movement of grain, both on the marine side and on the rail side. So we are recognizing that through the heritage attributes of the marine tower and the shipping tower as well. The brick warehouse building is also included. Its location on the spit and its orientation towards the lake and the town, again, to accommodate these two types of traffic. And then the painted sign on the side, and then its contribution to the landscape as a visual landmark and historical connection. So we've gone through and done that for the Watts Boathouse as well. You can see the sample heritage attributes here, as well as for the landscape as a whole. Our assignment was not just to look at the buildings by themselves, but to look at their overall setting in the landscape and how they relate to each other, to the overall harbor landscape and to the downtown landscape. So I'm going to pass it over to Amy to talk a little bit more about the engagement opportunities and what we've heard so far. And I guess I still have to share.
Yes, you need to share, and I'll ask you to change the slides when it comes up. So thank you, Kayla, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We definitely appreciate the opportunity to tell you more about what we've done so far and a little bit more about the process so that you have a better understanding. My role in this is as project manager, but I'm also part of the engagement coordination. And as Kayla mentioned, engagement for this is so critically important. So thank you all for being here tonight. Because as Kayla mentioned, you know, when we talk about significance to the community, we need to hear from the community to make sure that we're reflecting those sentiments and those values that we're laying out here. So I would like to thank all of you for participating in the survey. There was actually 492 people fill out survey 1, and I can assure you I looked through each and every one of those surveys and very much enjoyed some of the stories and the histories and stories about family members who had worked at the shipping industry or worked on the terminals themselves, and really fascinating feedback from everyone. So we do appreciate all of that. What you see in front of us is the Engage Collingwood page. And so I wanted to take a moment for those who haven't been there, and I suspect you all have, because this is how you access the meeting tonight. But I just wanted to point out a few things. So in the top right corner, you have the Contact Us page. This is going to be available for the duration of our assessment and always available for this project. It may not be Amanda for the whole thing. There may be other people at different parts down the line, but certainly there's always going to be a contact there for you to reach out to. Underneath it, you'll see the important links page. We have added to that the Ontario Heritage Toolkit link. This is a user-friendly guide. It's meant for communities. It's meant for people who have never really worked with heritage, haven't worked with the Ontario Heritage Act, to really give you a better understanding of how it works and why it works, and how you work through that process. And it provides a lot of examples, and I find it really user-friendly, and I often suggest it to people who are looking for a first place to learn more. Above it is the Ontario Heritage Act. If you are a legal junkie, I guess, you can certainly have a look at that. It's definitely the legal act and how things are all laid out. So very technical, but certainly provides a wealth of information if you're looking for specifics about the policy and how that works. Underneath it, you'll see the timeline. So built into this is the Built Heritage Assessment, but then you'll see there's further milestones as we move along. I encourage you to continue to check back into this page even after our assessment's complete, so that you can follow along with kind of what's being done and what the next steps are. Our heritage assessment is front and center right now on the newsfeed, and we will continue to provide updates and posts as they relate to engagement opportunities and when the study is complete and findings of that nature. Beside it, I've put a big arrow, the provide feedback portion. So this is where the survey is. And like I said, thank you to all those people who provided information on the first one. Thank you. I particularly love the stories about the turkeys that were originally housed near the grain terminal. That was news to our team, and we really enjoyed multiple stories actually about the turkeys. So thank you for that, whoever did that one. Beside it is the stories page. So if you have another story that you feel is critical and super important and is reflected in those attributes, or sorry, those values that Kayla had mentioned that we need to be made known about, please provide that. This is a public forum. I think you can send it privately, but please note that that will likely be visible, or you'll be given the option to make it visible. And then beside it is the questions tab. Throughout this whole process, we encourage you to ask your questions. We will try to provide answers in a timely manner. If we all of a sudden are seeing we're getting multiple questions of the same nature, we will be sure to respond to that and make sure that everyone knows in the newsfeed some of the questions we've gotten if we've heard it from multiple people. One last thing I'd like to say is we did have, obviously, as both Amanda and Kayla mentioned, we did have a booth this past Saturday, and a couple people had come up. We had some of the survey 2 in print form just to have on hand to walk people through it, but we did have some people commenting that they were having trouble accessing the form through the link through Engage. So if you are in that position, or you know somebody in that position, please get in contact with Amanda, and we can make sure that you get a copy, or you have an opportunity to get that feedback in, because it's really important that we do hear from you, especially in this survey, which, as Kayla mentioned, is the discussion about what we've come up with and how do you feel about that, and did we miss anything, and please provide your feedback of that nature. If you could go to the next page, please, Kayla. I just want to mention the engagement opportunities for the duration of our project. As I said, the survey is open now, and it will be open, survey 2 will be open until October 30th. And then we will be having a third survey online, which is anticipated to be up the last week of October or early November, and run for at least 2 weeks. This is another opportunity to give feedback and finesse and work with the heritage attributes that we've revised based on the comments we received in survey 2. And we would really appreciate any insight you have in that regard. So at this time, if you have a question, I'm going to ask you to put it in the Q&A box. If there are multiple questions and we aren't able to get to you, I will let you know that you can provide that question through that Engage Collingwood page on that little tab that I showed you, or you can follow up with Amanda as well. Put Amanda's contact at the bottom there, and we will certainly answer it if it's directed at us, or if it's a question for the town. Of course, Amanda can answer that and provide you more information. So if you do have a question, type it in the chat. I'm going to ask Kayla a question that we had gotten earlier, which I think is really important, and let's start off this Q&A with something that has already been asked and we feel is worthy of restating. So Kayla, the question was, can a property be designated under Part 4, which is the individual buildings, and Part 5, which is a Heritage Conservation District, through the Ontario Heritage Act? How are they different?
Thanks, Amy. So we did get this question, and we do recognize that this piece of property that we are looking at is already within the Collingwood Heritage Conservation District. But a property can be designated both under Part 4, that's the individual property, and Part 5. So what the difference is that an HCD looks at the broad character of an area. So the heritage attributes that apply may relate to a broader category of things, such as the setback of buildings, the layout, the road layout, the architectural styles largely, and the different areas or different character areas of a community. So in the case of Collingwood, there's the harbor portion as well as the downtown main streets portion. You may have heritage conservation districts with residential areas, with open park space, as well as with commercial areas. So those are all kind of specified with their specific heritage attributes to those larger categories. When you get down to an individual property designation, you can look at more specific heritage attributes of a building. So you can look at specific door or window openings, the construction materials, the location. So both of these mechanisms are about expressing the cultural heritage value and heritage attributes of a place. However, a Part 4 designation or looking at an individual property or individual properties in a more in-depth manner allows us to have more granularity in understanding what is important about a property. And I think that's particularly important in terms of managing change, especially to a building like this. The Heritage Conservation District does have some protection, but in terms of deciding how to manage change in the future, it doesn't provide a lot of heritage attributes specific to these buildings or the grain terminal buildings. So getting more granularity through a built heritage assessment, I think will provide some good information in terms of how to manage change on that property going forward.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. So we have our first question, which I'm not 100% sure we'll be able to answer, but I will ask our team here. We do have Sarah Clark, who's our researcher for this on hand, who might know the answer. So the question is, does the company that built the terminals still exist, or are there records available of what that company built?
So I can, do you want to answer, Sarah, or I can go broadly into what we have done in terms of our research. So the Collingwood Museum has an extensive collection of records regarding this building. So they have a lot of the building photos in terms of how the building was constructed. We also have the architectural drawings in terms of the layout and the floors. So yes, so it was designed and built by two different companies, but we do have records from both of them. I maybe will turn it over to Sarah to answer the specific records from those companies, but we did get them everything that the museum has on file for those.
Yeah, Kayla, in terms of records available for other things that the companies may have built, I'm sure they do exist. Unfortunately, right now we're in COVID times, so it's a little bit hard to access some of these records. And Kayla also mentioned that the Collingwood Museum has been just an amazing resource for all of the information that we've been able to collect to this point. So if there is something in particular that you're interested about, whether it would be the designer or the actual companies that constructed those buildings, that is something that we could consider looking into, I'm sure, when we do produce the history.
Okay, thank you both. Appreciate that. There's one other question, which I think Amanda will need to speak to. But the question is, can there be opportunities for people to see inside and experience the building?
Thanks, Amy. So in terms of access into the grain terminals, at this time, there are portions of the grain terminals that are not deemed to be safe for public access. That said, I am aware of some community stakeholders that have videos of inside the terminals. So I'm wondering if there might be an opportunity for us to get a hold of those records and possibly share them. So it's something I'm happy to take away with me and see what we might be able to do. Certainly recognizing that it's an incredible piece of history and likely many people would like to see what the insides of the grain terminals look like. So great question, and that's something I'll take away to see what I might be able to find. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I know that our report will also contain some photos of obviously of the site from our field view. So hopefully that will maybe give you some insight into some of the inner workings there, but they will be limited. I don't see any other questions here. I'm wondering if there's any questions, Kayla, you and I maybe answered at the booth that we might want to reiterate here. I think I can ask a question. I can tell from reading survey 1 that there was a lot of people who identified views that extended outside of the property, particularly from water or the sky or from coming over the hill as you enter in. There was, I think that was the number one answer to, you know, what makes it special to you is this sense of home and feeling like home and when you came over the hill. And so I'm just wondering if you can provide a little bit more information on some of the limitations of views or how the Ontario 906 allows views to be captured within it.
Yeah, so because the Ontario Heritage Act is limited to the property that is recognized, that is where the heritage attributes are listed, and thus help to manage change on that specific property. The views have to be related to that property. So it's hard to manage a view if you don't have any sort of mechanism for managing that view. So if you want to manage the view from very far away, you have very little control, or there isn't a heritage control anyway to be able to protect that view. I know some municipalities have put larger views in their official plan. Again, that is not a heritage mechanism, but it can be in the official plan for a longer view in terms of protection, sometimes towards churches or view corridors. So that basically just means that they're trying to limit heights of buildings. So I know there's one that's protected view in Toronto to Queen's Park and the view behind it. So there was a big controversy in terms of the towers that were being built behind Queen's Park. But again, that is a mechanism through the official plan. We are talking about the Ontario Heritage Act. And so those views are limited to the property that we're looking at, to and from the property that we're looking at. So I think one of our questions in our survey is asking people what views they value. And so while we can definitely document any of the other views that are outside of this specific property in terms of how the community views them, they probably are not going to make it into the heritage attribute list, just in terms of they can't be managed through the Ontario Heritage Act as a mechanism.
Thank you. So nice segue to the next question here about heritage attribute list.
Yeah.
The question is, are the many windows at the top of the silos being considered as a heritage attribute?
So I think that I'm not sure if we put them in or not, but we definitely have asked a question about them in the survey, because I think that is a question that we've had while we've been looking at them. I'd like to point out that there is a difference between window openings and the windows themselves in terms of specifying a heritage attribute. So basically what that means is, for example, we'll go back to our house example. Our Italianate house example, usually the windows on those are arched. or the window openings on those are arched, but the window in terms of how the different panes of glass are fit together may or may not be a heritage attribute. What we may care about is that actually arched opening. We don't want someone to put in a rectangular window opening in that building, but in terms of the actual window that's in it, we might not care about how the panes are exactly arranged. So in terms of this building, the windows that are across the top, I think I'd like to know in terms of people's thoughts about that. Do we care about the fact that there is a opportunity for windows and it is long and rectangular and it goes across the entire length of the building up there? Or do we care about, or maybe we care about both, or do we care about the way that the panes are arranged and the size of the panes, and the fact that these are metal mullions, which is basically the metal that sits between all of the panes. So again, this is what's allowing us to get that granular view to be able to provide guidance and be able to manage change in the future. If someone, say, wanted to adaptively reuse that space, remove those windows with the various small panes and put in one, well, maybe not one continuous because that might be too big, but a larger pane of glass up there to provide a different viewing opportunity from that area. Would that be impacting the cultural heritage value? So sorry, that's a little long-winded. I know.
No, that's a great answer. No, it's a great answer because there's another question about windows as well. And so this one we may not have the answer to, but they're asking if we have any idea why the top level was built with those beautiful windows.
I would assume that it had to do with probably the functionality of that room, because that is the bin floor up there. So you'll see pictures probably in our report in terms of how all the grain was moving between bins. And there's long conveyor belts in terms of moving things around up there. So I would assume, again, don't quote me on that. I am not, I don't have all the mechanics quite down yet. We are working on that part of the report, but I would assume that it is to provide natural light into that area because there was a lot more people in that particular area of the building moving things around.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate, nothing came out in the research that was specifically spoke to that, but much like Kayla suggested, this would be a functionality thing to let natural light in to allow for just the visibility in that building and in that particular space. So, okay, thank you. We have another question here. What Canadian or international examples of repurposing heritage properties of this type inspire the experts at ARA?
Well, first, I'd like to say as a caveat, that's actually not part of our assignment in terms of looking at the types of adaptive reuses of these types of buildings. So that will not be included in our report. I believe there has been some previous work done on that, and I'm sure there will be some discussions going forward in the future. But in terms of informing our work and talking about these things that might be heritage attributes, there are quite a few academic theses that we've looked at looking at the types of adaptive reuse and actually the research into these types of constructions, which is how we've kind of been able to narrow down this distinction between urban silos and the prairie silos, and in terms of silo construction in general, the themes and the stages that happened across Canada.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. Well, there's no other questions and we're at 7:55, so this works out well to wrap up. I'd just like to thank everyone for coming, asking great questions, listening, and gaining more insight into what we're doing as through the Built Heritage Assessment. And because my role is primary engagement, I'm going to really encourage you to do that survey too. I know it's been said many times, but we would all really love to hear your feedback. And I think, you know, it's important that we get a great understanding. So please feel free to write a novel. I will read it, and I will make sure that information is passed on, and in spaces where it's needed, it will be integrated into how we move forward. So that's it for me. Thank you. I'll see if Kayla or Amanda would like to do final words, but thank you so much.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for coming and listening to me rattle on about heritage for quite a long time. I love talking about it, and it is quite a complex, it can be quite complex, so I hope we've been able to make it understandable for everyone. But again, if you have any questions, we have been monitoring that question box on the Engage Collingwood, so we're happy to talk about any of these things more in depth.
Thank you, Kayla, and thank you so much, Amy, as well, and to Sarah for attending from ARA, and for Shelby for your help as well. And certainly thank you to everyone that took an hour out of your evening to join us. If you do have any questions that I can specifically help you with from Town of Collingwood, please feel free to email me directly, and I'm happy to try and get you those responses. And again, if you do wish to get a paper copy of the survey, please let me know, and I'd be happy to arrange that. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a great evening. Take care.